Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, Scaling Feature Flag Management for Better Progressive Delivery, brought to you by CloudBees. I will introduce you to our presenters. Today we have Nick Rendell, Senior Product Marketing Manager at CloudBees, and Jamie Melnick-Perrin, Product Manager at CloudBees. Nick, it's all yours. Take it away.
Hey, Rich, thank you very much. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to learn a little bit about feature flagging and progressive delivery. So before we dive into the best practices around scaling and how you really want to set up feature flags for your specific environments, let's just give a brief history of feature flags and why they are becoming so popular as a tool with software delivery today. So for those of you that are new to the concept of feature flagging, they may also be known as feature flippers, maybe feature toggles at your org as well. In the most basic sense, a feature flag is a if statement in your code. So if something happens, then something else happens as well. But the big point is you don't have to redeploy your application to get to that point. The biggest technical change that feature flags impact is that they separate the technical process of code deployment from the business decision of when a feature is released. So this unlocks a variety of benefits around risk mitigation, developer productivity, and experimentation. And I would note feature flags are really not a brand new technology, and they've been used by developers individually for some time. However, formalizing their usage and their management across organizations was really pioneered in about the last decade. And that was by some of the well-known software development pioneers like Uber and Facebook and Netflix. And once the rest of the industry started to see their usage, it began to spread. And now, quote, normal companies that might not be have as many engineers as Netflix and Uber are beginning to catch up and start standardizing their use in their processes as well. And so why are development teams moving towards this practice of using feature flags? And really, it's because even with the most mature CI/CD practices today, software development is still far slower and costlier than most companies want. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And the first is, risky releases. And releases still remain risky in many situations, for better or worse, just because they are what we call a traditional big bang release. And that's where all users receive an update at once and are slower to, and this means that, all at once, if something goes wrong, it's kind of all hands on deck. And this type of software release is slower to develop because you want to make sure nothing does go wrong, and therefore you have to test slower and really make sure that everything is accounted for around any potential outcomes. But it is also all hands on deck if something does go wrong. And it means that if you do have to roll back this major release, you're going to have all of your developers on it, you're going to have your ops team on it, and it can really ruin a lot of people's days. I mean, it can take days, hours to days to roll back a release in this scenario. And it's not ideal, and it's not ideal in kind of this new era of software development. And again, even with mature CI/CD, like bottlenecks still remain. There are many different tools and many different companies out there that are doing their best to eliminate these bottlenecks. But again, even with mature CI/CD processes, they can still exist, right? And one of the main ones that typically exists, even with more modern software delivery tools, is this concept of feature branching and having to merge long-lived feature branches back into trunk. This creates a concept called merge hell that developers are familiar with, and this really slows down the CI process. And further, even the most robust pre-production test environments, they cannot fully recreate the realities of a production environment. And so this slows down the testing process because you have to ensure that all potential scenarios from production are considered. And it means that there is still potential for bugs or other technical errors once the code hits production. We like to say at CloudBees that production is kind of the final test, right? Because if you're not testing in production, once that code hits production, you kind of cross your fingers and hope for the best, and that is the final test. And in more cases than not, I mean, again, CI/CD has come so far in the last decade, but at the end of the day, most development orgs do not have time to really do robust beta programs and really enable user feedback along the way within their software development processes. Most teams are still focused on ensuring that they get the code out as fast as possible, obviously as bug-free as possible, but that does not always mean it's perfectly aligned with end users and what they want. And so if you don't have that consistent user group, it might technically work perfectly, but sometimes you just miss the mark with what users were really looking for. I mean, ask any product manager, this happens all the time. And at that point, it's a different scenario from something actually breaking, but it's equally, the outcome is the same, and you have to spend additional cycles fixing a new feature, even rolling something back and starting from scratch. Regardless, it's not ideal. And lastly, there are still siloed processes across software delivery. I don't think this is a surprise. I mean, the best efforts of any CD, RO technology, I mean, despite the best efforts, there's still silos, right? And, this is due to work being completed by disparate teams, tools, I mean, you name it, you've probably seen it at your enterprise org, right? But this actually still grows, with feature flags, and it can even get worse by using feature flags if there isn't centralized management. So something to think about across the process. So thinking about feature flags, there are these if statements in your code. How can they really help solve, kind of these 4 pillars of, of kind of software headaches, for lack of a better term, right? First and foremost, feature flags, despite all the lovely use cases around A/B testing and all the fun stuff, at their most basic point, they are a risk mitigation tool, right? And they reduce release risk by allowing functionality to be pushed into production, and they allow it to be instantly disabled with the click of a button if something does go wrong. We call this the kill switch at CloudBees, right? And so that means no crazy rollbacks, no all hands on deck dev and ops teams running around to get something pushed back. It's one developer, one button. It allows like a much higher level of confidence to push things into production because they can be instantly disabled so fast. In fact, some of our customers, again, it's not something you think of when you think of feature flags, but like some of our customers, we've asked them, what is the best part of using our tool? And one of the first things they bring up is mean time to recovery, right? It's not just about pushing code out faster. It's how quickly can you recover from something if something does go wrong, and to the point that some of our customers are like, we reduced this by 80-90% mean time to recovery because it's just one developer, one button versus the old processes. Next up, they are also a developer productivity tool. They improve, they enable very clean trunk-based development where, that concept of, merge branching or branch merging and merge hell and everything, it's largely eliminated because you can, now develop much closer to trunk. You can simply disable a feature in a trunk and, get all the code updates from trunk while still working on it kind of in parallel. So the days of long-lived feature branches and merge hell are largely out in the past. And again, they enable this concept of safe testing in production, right? And the phrase testing in production, I think, gives a lot of people some bad feelings, right? And some feelings of some butterflies in their stomach, right? But this is a very partitioned way of doing it. I'll talk about this in a moment when I talk about progressive delivery, but it's very safe partition method of getting your code into production to see how it performs, but not impacting the rest of your user base. And kind of in line with that, with this concept of progressive delivery, you have the ability to shorten your feedback loops, and you might start testing in production with internal users, but you can very safely and methodically push out new feature updates to real users in your database. And that's the concept of progressive delivery, and it's kind of the end state that we're pushing for with feature flags. And really, you can simplify processes across CI/CD, and this is where I kind of go back to, even mature CI/CD is not perfect. It has its shortcomings, and feature flags, they shore up some of those. They provide additional risk mitigation. They provide, the ability to push out code faster. They provide much more granular continuous delivery processes. So, they're a way to kind of supercharge CI/CD in some ways. I mean, there's this, I think there's a misconception that you have to have, CI and CD mastered before you look at moving into feature flags, and we don't really see it that way. We see it as kind of the secret ingredient of CI/CD to mature your processes even faster. So I kind of alluded to this on the last slide, but what is kind of the desired end state when using feature flags? And it is this concept of progressive delivery, really at enterprise scale. And so again, feature flags, they decouple the process of deployment and release. And this allows you to push out features much more gradually. You can push them out to production, only release it to, again, your internal QA users who are able to spin up, to work on this in the live environment instead of a pre-production environment. You are able to, once it passes QA, like slowly push it out to maybe if you do have beta customers or you do want to roll it out to only a specific geography or app version or whatever else. But this kind of infinity loop is going to look different at every company. But what it is going to show is an ability to get much more iterative and granular in your release process, and get you away from that concept of big bang, one big release for everybody at once, where you cross your fingers and hope for the best. So progressive delivery, we believe this is really the future. We want this to be a process that has the visibility, the control, the automation across your entire CI/CD pipelines. And once you can get to that point, the way that you deliver software completely changes permanently, and it completely changes for the better. This is really kind of as much of a natural evolution of software delivery as CI/CD has been in the last decade. So this all sounds amazing, right? And you're all ready to get going with feature flags, but what are the downsides of feature flags, and why are you maybe not quite where you want to be, and why are you not delivering with that beautiful infinity loop that I just showed? And the short answer is, feature flags are great, but really they're great in small quantities, right? I had one analyst tell me one time that everyone loves feature flags until you have more than about 10, and then they become a headache, right? And as you can see on kind of this homemade graph of what we see with most of our customers is, typically, you might think feature flags aren't being used at your order date. Chances are they are. You might not know it, but chances are they are, right? And typically, the number of flags starts with a few developers using them at once. That might get expanded as a development technique to more and more teams. You might get an executive sponsor that says, hey, like, I saw a webinar on DZone, right? And this is interesting. Why don't we try and push this out further, right? There's a lot of kind of inflection points for flags getting scaled, and typically, you get to kind of the big point where, like you see on, with the Jaws meme, you need a bigger boat, right? And there's going to be some headaches that start to arise, and these can be headaches around infrastructure. They can be headaches around, the visibility and the governance, and the headaches that arise due to testing. And this is really what we're focusing on today is, what are the headaches that you are going to encounter anytime you start scaling your feature flags? What are some kind of best practices for how to get around them? And, how can you really just kind of set up yourself up for foundations for success for how to scale? So looking first at governance, right? What is governance, and why do you care about it through the lens of feature flagging? So, there's questions on the screen here that you should be asking yourself, like, if you're using feature flags today, can you answer them? Can you not? Right? Many feature flagging processes and management systems, they tend to fall short simply because the governance controls aren't there, right? And I want to go back to, again, what is a feature flag? A feature flag is the ability to change the behavior of an application in runtime, right? That is extremely powerful, and if used correctly, it is a very a very eloquent way to change code in production and change your processes. But a single developer being able to change code in production, that is also a very scary concept for many CIOs if there is not the oversight needed and there is not the proper controls and kind of approval flows on the back end for how to do it. And it's not just like the developer oversight. As flagging practices mature, there's going to be more and more stakeholders within your company that kind of want to have their hand in the jar of using feature flags, right? And that might be product management, that might be marketing. In really mature companies, you might even have account teams with the ability to change a flag's value so that they can change functionality in one of their big accounts, right? So like as practices grow, you have to have a very clear, very structured ability to understand who can change a flag's value and when and why and all that sort of stuff. And moving on to visibility, so like even if you figured out who can change those features, the simple concept of understanding flag status is actually more complex than it seems, right? And you might have hundreds of developers flagging features, both technical and the non-technical person wanting to know that the status of flags. And typically, most homegrown systems that we see, they start by managing flags in configuration tables, and that's of less use to less technical personnel, right? They're not used to managing values in that way. They want a nice clean UI, and that might be great for developers, but not anyone outside of that org, right? And so this at minimum can cause a headache, and slow down a release. You might have to have developers sharing screens and kind of providing more manual updates. But again, think about it at scale. We're talking hundreds of developers, maybe up to thousands of flags. This becomes very messy very quickly, right? And there's a really famous example of this, from 2012. And again, this is an extreme example, but it's fairly common in the industry. And this was the concept where there's a company called Knight Capital, and they were unaware that a feature flag existed in their code, right? Again, a visibility problem, and they accidentally turned it on. And this was a financial trading institution, millions of dollars changing hands, very quickly. And they turned one flag on. It created a major trading error in their system, and they assumed a $460 million loss in a matter of 45 minutes. And this is all due to one feature flag being changed without knowledge. And so that's extreme, but think about that even on a feature level or an application level, and big changes can little errors can equal big changes with lack of visibility, right? And testing also gets more complex for a variety of reasons. Testing in production, as I mentioned, it can actually expedite some QA and user acceptance testing, but it can actually feature flags actually slow down the process in lower environments. Flags add complexity to builds, where different flag configurations create different test results. This shouldn't be a surprise, given an if-then statement creates two versions of a application automatically, right? And so, creating a method for quickly identifying what flag updates cause which build failures, that will begin to matter. And, of course, if you're using different tools for flag management than your build pipelines, there's just going to be a level of context switching that's added to the process. Okay, and lastly, technical debt, right? And this is really kind of the elephant in the room with feature flags. This is, I think in the many calls I've had through the years around, like, what do companies want to adopt feature flags? What are the first questions they ask? I would say technical debt tends to be that first question, right? And why is that? Because feature flags, without a doubt, they add technical debt to a code base. That technical debt was the reason that Knight Capital, like I just mentioned, had the issues it did. An old flag in their code was never removed, and it was erroneously turned on. So failure to remove flags, it creates cluttered code, which is harder to maintain and test. This also, you run the risk of an old flag evaluating to a state that is invalid, maybe undesirable, headaches in your code. So, from a pure ease of use standpoint, it becomes harder to update and manage flags when we're having to sift through hundreds and maybe even thousands of flags in your system, right? And this is exacerbated by the fact that there are different types of flags. If you look at, all of which have different uses and different flag lifespans. As you can see from the diagram on the right, from a very famous blog on Martin Fowler's website, there are really four types of toggles, right? There's an ops toggle, also known as a kill switch, which I brought up before. There is permissioning toggles that might remain in your code forever. And then there's, release and experimentation toggles that, have a pretty short life, and they probably will be removed soon after they're used. So creating a process and a system for determining what flags are used for what purpose, when they can be removed, if ever, and that is critical for managing technical debt caused by flags. So these are some of the challenges you may encounter. I'm going to now shift to what can you do about it before moving on, and then at the end, Jamie's going to get on and really hone in on the technical debt point and talk about the life of a flag and some of the best practices you can use to ensure that it lives as long as it should, but then it's quickly moved out of your code. So going first to the solutions of governance, and what can you do about governance if you're using flags today, if you've got a homegrown system. With governance, you really want to think about the practice and principle of least access. And this is where users have only have access to the tools and the information they need. At the same time, they might be simultaneously unaware, again, with restricted access to other assets they don't need, right? This is a fairly common principle, in the world of software development, and really enterprise governance as a whole, right? So putting this in terms of feature flag management, an organization should really be assessing what assets it holds for feature flagging. They're going to have a variety of applications and deliverables beneath it. Within each application or deliverable, there's going to be a various number of branches, environment states, and within those, there's going to be a number of feature flag configurations that exist. So you think about this within your org, think about, what users need to be admitted to what application and what stage and what process, it's going to be different, right, for everybody. But think about that principle of least access and what it means for you. So, at CloudBees, how do we handle this? One way we try to practice governance within our product is through the implementation of an application administrator. So this will, allows that admin to invite, manage permissions, set up integrations with any individual user within that organization. And again, these users, they see what they need to see and they see nothing else, right? And that's key for, the broader picture of feature flagging. This is a more granular level of control, and it really acts as an intermediary between like an org administrator and then the users, which are at the application level. And so these application admins, they also allow for flag approval and a flag approval flow process. So for us, that might mean, a user sets a flag value, like that application admin might get an email that says, hey, so-and-so is wanting to update this, yes or no, right? And you get kind of that natural governance within the stack. So that's important, when your executives ask, oh, you're using feature flags, show me how you determine how a value changes. Having, different levels of administrators and really, honing in on who can see what and who can approve what, really becomes critical. And while this works for administrators, you also want to consider some sort, potentially a GitOps approach for your developers if possible. So if you're familiar with GitOps or you're already using your org, those same principles can be applied to feature flagging. So most developers want to work and make changes in their own environments. This is not a surprise. So in this tool, we also want to allow changes to go through, configuration as code, right? And so this process would allow, bidirectional communication where any change in, the dashboard, if you have one, is stored as a commit to a YAML file in your repo as well. And then that maps out all the flag configurations and vice versa. So really, the advantage here is that you can get that same goodness that I just described with the application admin, but it's now in the form of a pull request control that developers use with their source code repo. So this allows the same type of approval flow, but it's just in kind of the natural way that developers want to work, which is pull requests and using GitHub or or Bitbucket or something like that. So governance can take many different forms. Now, I do want to add, this is not just about governance within your feature flagging system, or anything else. Again, back to the bigger picture, you want feature flags to really be a seamless process within the rest of your CI/CD pipeline, right? So it's not limited to feature flagging tools. Look at how governance is set up in CD as well, right? And you want strict release governance policies to be followed, even with developers updating flags and making your executives sweat, in that process potentially, right? So, simply put, flag governance in release pipelines, you want it there so that you put the control of feature flagging back where your ops team wants it, and that's of course in their hands. You want your release managers to have the final say, so to speak, of who is seeing, what feature is being flagged, what is its status, all of that kind of checks and balances before anything goes out. This is a great way of getting the goodness of feature flags without any of the potential governance downsides, right? Moving into visibility, with governance, we talked about how we can scale feature flag usage across various teams. This is kind of all for nothing though if teams are not enabled to communicate these changes via cross-team collaboration, right? We need to make sure that teams can see what changes were made to a flag configuration, who made those changes, and ideally have some sort of log of when those changes were made, an audit log, right? So if you're using like a database of variables, maybe you have a homegrown solution today, it's really important to have some audit trail or some storage of this information. So if something, well, I say if something, when something inevitably goes wrong, as it always does, your developers and your other team members can quickly debug a problem by just looking at the history of a flag's value. So there's a variety of ways to do this, to communicate. I mean, of course, more enterprise ready tools, like they're going to have a UI with beautiful audit logs in them, and the kind of the list of all the changes that have been made. But it doesn't stop there. You really want your visibility of flags to be set up seamlessly within the tools that you're already using today. Again, this helps you scale usage of feature flags faster, and you really want to look at how can you integrate your flagging practice into tools like Jira, Slack, Microsoft Teams. So you can naturally view and troubleshoot these changes in real time, right? So for example, our platform, it integrates with Slack, and what you can do there is teams can set up channels, and they can really hone in on only seeing the updates for the applications that they're assigned to. And then that channel acts as kind of a natural, push update, a natural audit log to see, really in any period of time, how's the flag changed, who did it, who's in trouble, right? If something breaks, all that sort of thing, all visible in Slack. And since, your devs most likely are living in Slack or maybe Microsoft Teams anyway, they just get to naturally kind of have it in the method that they work in. And again, back to CI/CD, we kind of already talked about pipeline governance. I would add, again, kind of look at your flagging practice, look at how you're doing CI today. You also want to see, if you can build flag visibility into your CI builds, if possible. And, that's really in case, there's probably going to be a time where a flag breaks a build for whatever reason, right? It happens. But having any level of visibility within your builds, so you can see the before and after state of a flag status to determine, if the flag is the reason a build breaks, that just speeds up the process. So like, for example, being CloudBees, of course, our tool integrates with Jenkins, right? And we have an integration where, you can see the before and after states of flags. And, if flags are one of the many causes for a build breaking, you at least know that right away, right? And I already touch on governance with, feature flagging, and it's kind of the same thing for visibility, right? I mean, those two topics go really hand in hand. So, again, making sure that the status of flags is visible within your release pipeline, knowing, what features are flagged, what the flag status is. It's just critical for your ops team. I mean, DevOps being what it is, you want dev and ops to really be working hand in hand as much as possible. So by having flag status, somewhere visible for your ops team, it's just going to make their lives a lot happier and kind of build that relationship further. And lastly, let's kind of look at testing before we dive into the big topic around technical debt management and flag lifecycling. So, as I mentioned, testing with feature flags, it can be a bit tricky. Given the ideal governance and permissioning of flags, teams might be tempted to set flag configurations with their specific values, to whatever they need it for, right? So that they can test. But the problem here is, that's not really scalable, especially when you're talking about potentially hundreds of flags, right? And the length of each configuration will grow as the number of users, their flag dependencies and their variables rise, right? And with this complexity, the sheer process involved of testing flags, it grows over time as well. And you're going to have just more and more different configurations that you'd have to test. So what you should really be looking to do, to speed up the process of testing flags, is you need to determine how you can enable your developers to test quickly and move faster, without having to context switch, and kind of disrupt the rest of your team with changing flag values. So, look at how you can test locally is what I'm getting at. So for our tool, that means we have a local storage container that mimics the storage of the flag dashboard. And so for us, that means, a local developer can test all the different flag configurations with their change, but not actually disrupt the rest of the flags within your environment. So that's important over time. That makes developers happy because they can just do it on their own. It makes their teammates happy because there's no flags getting changed unnecessarily, and everyone is a bit happier. So I've covered flag governance, I covered visibility, I touched on testing. Jamie's going to kind of deep dive now around, I think, the bigger topic today around flag lifecycling and technical debt management and how to focus on that as you scale your practices. So with that, I will hand it over to Jamie and let him take it away.
Hello. Thank you, Nick. So as Nick mentioned, I'm going to switch gears and spend some time digging into the typical anatomy and life cycle of a feature flag. Using a basic flag as our example, I'll demonstrate some best practices that could be implemented around specific parts of the life cycle that will hopefully help you better manage your flags. So first, let's look at what is the typical life of a flag. At CloudBees, we would break that down into a few key stages. Creation, naming their flag, setting up your workflow, deciding the type of flag, implementing the code, and then it moves on to the release cycle. You might have a typical product release cycle of 5% of users, 15%, 50%, up to 100%, and that could be time gated as well. And then the next stage would be monitoring flag status. This is something that is not unique to CloudBees feature management, where we have different flag statuses to represent the impressions being received by the flag. And then afterwards is the cleanup process, removing the flag, cleaning up in feature management, and making sure that you don't let that snowball into technical debt. Okay, let's talk about naming conventions. The life of a flag to us begins with its name. It's a best practice to name flags in a way that can provide meaningful context, just like you would a variable or a class. But it can also be used for enabling a better workflow or integrating with other tools. A few examples here, starting off with just a basic name that provides context into what it does. So enable tutorial describes the feature or functionality, and then it becomes easier to find, track, and manage. In our second example, the flag has the flag type included in the name to give you an idea of the lifespan of the flag. And it will be easier for you to search and filter for flags based on what type of flag it is if it's in the name. And then our third example here is going a step further and adding a unique identifier that's often used for analytics or other third-party tools. So for those reasons, flags are unique in CloudBees feature management and that they can only be used once. Next, we recommend making flag management part of your workflow and making sure to set that up during the creation process. CloudBees feature management has direct Jira integration, so you can create tickets and link them directly to a flag. This is an example of what that ticket might look like. You'll notice how the task is denoted with FF to represent it has to do with managing a feature flag. Here we have a task for the feature flag, and that task might be part of a story or an epic for the feature you're working on. And then you could have a bunch of subtasks to break down the different parts of the flag lifecycle, and then assign those subtasks to the appropriate person who would be completing them. We find this system works very well because it's common that a developer might be creating the flag, a product owner would be managing the release cycle, and then someone else entirely might end up cleaning the flag at a later date. At some point in the creation process, you're going to need to decide what kind of flag are you making. Feature flags are usually permanent or temporary and fall into these categories. So DevOps flags and configuration tend to be permanent, and then temporary flags are infrastructure, feature releases, experiments, A/B testing, performance improvements, and things along those lines. For our flag, it's going to be temporary, and that functionality is going to be gated behind an if statement. So we're just going to be turning it on, testing stuff out, analyzing the results, making decisions and changes based off that, and then turning it back off. As a general rule, it's best to use as few permanent flags as possible. You've probably heard of the term spaghetti code. Well, if you have a lot of permanent flags and then eventual dependencies on those flags, it can result in spaghetti flags, which is even worse. So this is a quick example of what our flag looks like in a React application using JavaScript. We're importing rocks from the rocks browser package, creating the flag class to store our flag inside, and then rollout is initialized asynchronously. It has options, it registers the flags to CloudBees feature management, and then the logic for our flag is stored in the if statement. Moving on, each flag is going to have a unique release cycle depending on what kind of flag it is and what it does. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to flags, but there are some common patterns. For example, a feature rollout for business to business might go developer and then all developers in Q&A, and then a gradual rollout to tier 1 companies. Whereas a feature rollout to business to consumer applications might go dev, QA, internal employees, and then a 5, 15, 50%, 100% release, and that could also be time gated. Looking at our flag here, we're doing something similar to the second example for a consumer app. We have a 20%, 70%, and 100%, and they're all time gated. This rollout model would allow us to monitor for critical issues on the first step at 20%. And then if everything goes well, we continue with the release to more users to gather larger volume of data, which would give us meaningful feedback to make changes to our flag along the way. So CloudBees feature management, like I mentioned, utilizes a flag status system. For each environment, we report a status for each feature flag. The feature flag status is there to help you understand where the flag is in its life cycle. This flag status should help you with questions such as, has the flag been deployed? Is the flag unused? Is it serving the same value to all target groups? And that should help you with your final decision, which is the cleanup. Everyone knows that cluttered code is harder to maintain and test. With feature flags, we find that unnecessary code often sticks around because nobody remembers why it exists. And there's a fear that if you touch something, it's going to break. Failure to remove the flags, though, leads to cluttered code. With CloudBees feature management, our feature flags that are no longer used in any environment can be safely deleted using the cleanup screen. The cleanup screen helps you determine when it's safe to delete your unused flags that have been fully deployed. We typically think that it's safe to delete a flag when targeting is turned off, the flag is in an inactive status, all JIRA tasks are completed if there are any attached to it, and then more recently with a new feature we rolled out with GitHub code references, if you have that set up as well, then we would want those to be removed as well.
Awesome.
All right, thank you. Going back to Nick now.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. So, really what we're trying to show there is, that obviously that's our tool in action, but there's really, some low-hanging fruit around, regardless where you're at with your feature flag maturity, naming conventions and understanding like the use cases of flag and designating them accordingly. There are things that, hey, great. If you want to use a system, that's kind of ready for big business, like that's great. But even if you don't, I mean, the point that we're making here is there's some very simple practices that you can do just to ensure that you're getting flags out of your code in some basis, right? I mean, if it's as simple as tracking them with an Excel sheet to start, and a standard naming convention, I mean, that's still better than nothing, and that's still a great point to start. But of course, if you want to ramp up, there's plenty of tooling out there that gets you to that point faster. So kind of, we've talked about how to scale. I mean, shifting points a bit, outside of like tooling, what are the big like process and cultural recommendations that you should consider as you get your program going? The first of which, again, like no surprise, but you need to kind of create a process and a culture of tackling flag lifecycling debt, as early as possible. And what you never want, regardless of the size of your program, is that spaghetti code and all these hidden flags in your code that you have no idea are there. So lay that foundation, figure out your naming conventions, figure out your processes across teams that are traceable and visible to get going. And you're going to be, thanking me later when you don't have all of these zombie flags in your code over time, right? Next, really plan and update all of your processes and your workflows to get really the maximum benefits out of progressive delivery. And this applies to your developers, and how they are pushing their code out. But really, this also is just as important for your product marketing, your product management, your marketing, your account teams. If you're really getting into the concepts of progressive delivery and pushing out, code to specific user groups and testing it, like that's only good if it's, you have a smooth process for doing so. You have, feedback loops with your user data tools, data analysis tools, all that sort of thing. You're only as good as the processes that your flagging integrates with, right? And so that applies to, the analysis of features, but that also applies to your internal collaboration tools. So like I mentioned around Slack and GitHub and Teams and Jira, you want to be plugging your practices there as much as possible into the tools you're already using so that there's adoption, but there's also a clear method of setting up processes with flags. And lastly, there's going to be a level, there's a concept of kind of incomplete code being released, right? And incomplete is misleading, but what we're saying there is you might have a feature that's only 75% finished that you want to push out to either your QA team or your user group or something like that. There are many companies out there that have policies against this, and ensuring that your release processes reflect this new world that you live in is critical, really, to successfully scale. Because your CD, your ops team and your CD pipeline, I mean, you have to ensure that they understand how to get the most out of feature flags, and that application version, for example, is it's really no longer your single source of truth, because there's going to be multiple versions running at once. So having that understanding of how that works with the rest of your tool sets, your CI/CD pipelines, that's really key over time. So, lots of benefits to feature flags. We hope we haven't kind of scared you from the downsides. I mean, it's really about managing them early on and kind of scaling from there. So lastly, kind of the word from our sponsors, like if this is interesting to you, if you don't want to go through the effort of kind of manually setting up some of these processes to really get the most out of flags, I did want to announce we recently released, in our opinion, the industry's best community edition of our own tool. So for that means you get up to 15 users that can use, our own enterprise grade feature flag management system for free forever. You get 250,000 MAU, and really, what we're happy about with this tool is you just get a lot of enterprise functionality that you don't get, either with your homegrown system or other tools out there. So, items like the flag lifecycling that Jamie showed, and the the enterprise proxy that we have, flag approval flows, really rich enterprise features, that's all ready for you out of the box. And, at 15 users, in many cases, an entire development team can get going. So if that's interesting for you, that is available to get started on our website. You can be up and running in, really minutes with SDK installation, and encourage you to check it out. So that's all we had today. We wanted to keep it pretty short and sweet and kind of open it up for questions that you might have around how to scale feature flags and really anything about the practice. So with that, we will, there's a question box on the right-hand side of your screen that you can go ahead and enter them into, and we'll go from there. Okay, looks like I've got one question about, is feature flagging synonymous with A/B testing? Are these the same things like with tools like Google Optimize? This is a good question. I think it's, it's one of the most common misconceptions about feature flagging. Like, if you already A/B test content on your website, is this the same thing as using a feature flag to release? And the quick answer is no, right? Like there's on-page, kind of content level A/B testing that occurs on the user experience side. But what you're getting with feature flags is, yes, it does enable a level of experimentation in A/B testing, but it's, feature flagging is much more about the technical performance of flags, of features, right? And so like, it's not just about that content level, it's about, the technical performance. How's a feature actually acting in production, and that sort of thing. So with that, feature flags are a much richer level of A/B testing, of feature testing, that sort of thing, because you're getting that feature context that you're not getting with like a content level A/B testing tool, of just like on-page testing on a website and that sort of thing. Okay, I've got one here. Let's see. If we want to migrate flags or flag values from our old system to a new one, what does that process look like? I don't want to say this is completely simple, but it's also not going to ruin your month, so to speak, right? So, if you're using a database table or a flag congruence system, or really you just want to use a mapping file, and you can map your old flags from your homegrown system, your config tables, to an enterprise platform, and it's going to be definitely some hours of work, but not a project that requires professional services and that sort of thing. Okay, I've got one. Does feature flagging store our customers' data? I guess this question would be in relation to, I guess, kind of around the A/B testing point. The quick answer is certain tools do out there. I think this is one concern we didn't really touch on around, why companies might not be ready to adopt a tool. If you're specifically a customer that might, be in financial services or, healthcare or something that has really sensitive customer data, some feature like third-party tools might store that data, on their servers, for the purpose of experimentation and seeing what customer has been rolled out to. So our tool actually doesn't. We specifically don't want that information, and kind of wanted to make sure that that information stays on your server. So like our tool actually, all the evaluation happens on your side, on the client side, and we don't get any of that information in our servers. So it is possible to do feature flagging without storing that information, but depending on how you do it and who you choose, that's definitely a consideration for sure. I think that's all the questions I'm seeing. If there's any more, feel free to put them in the chat, but I think that's all I'm seeing for now. We can wait one more moment.
And Nick, if you and Jamie are available on social, are you available on social, or in any way our attendees can get in contact with you if they come up with further questions down the road?
Yeah, we're both on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to us there, and we'll get the ball rolling and probably switch over to email from there. But I realize this is a new concept for a lot of you, and we are here to help. There's also a variety of resources on our blog around flag lifecycling and kind of best practices for scaling from there that don't involve just adopting a new system. So I encourage you to look at our blog, kind of find those best practices, and we'll try and send some of those out kind of in the follow-up email.
Great, thank you. With that, DZone would like to thank Nick and Jamie for a great presentation. We would also like to thank CloudBees for providing our audience with an outstanding webinar. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope you learned something new that will help you in your developer career.